This is the VIC-II Kawari Mini. It's a modern VIC-II replacement for your Commodore 64. And I've been testing it out over the last few days, just looking at some of the features that it's got, and I must say I was pretty impressed. That was until I plugged it into the RetroTink 5X. What the fuck? So as you can probably see on my regular display, it looked pretty damn good. The palette might have been a little bit different, but that's fixable in software. But with the RetroTink 5X, it looked absolutely terrible. We'll get back to why that is later on. First of all, I just want to explore some of the features of this thing and go over a bit of a history of how it came to be. So this is a project started by Randy Rossi just over a couple of years ago, and his mission was to make a VIC-II replacement using modern components, something that pretty much hadn't been done up to this point. And this project has gone through a number of changes, mainly due to the global parts shortage, or we should probably think of it as the global price gouge, but this is what it looks like now. This particular one is the mini version, but there is also a full-size version which outputs HDMI. Well, technically it's DVI over a HDMI cable, but this one here only outputs Luma and Chroma, but it does come with a bunch of other features which we're going to explore. There are plans for a POV version, or plain old VIC, which pretty much strips off all the extra features and is just designed as a drop-in replacement for the VIC-II. But as of right now, only the mini version is available, with the full-size version coming very soon, I believe. You might have seen this on a couple of other YouTube channels. I know Jan Beta and Adrian Black got the prototype HDMI version. This was prior to the global price gouge, so it has changed designs, and the full-size one and the mini one use a Treon FPGA. The original full-size version used a Xilinx, but yeah, the prices have shot up. If you want more info on that and to look at the development progress, be sure to check out Randy's channel. I'll link that up there. But for now, let's explore some of the cool features of the mini board. Right, so I've got my trusty ZIF socketed Commodore 64 on the bench. Let's put this thing in. Installation of the Kawari is very simple. You literally open up your Commodore 64, pop out the old VIC, and put the Kawari in. Making sure to get the notch in the same alignment as the original VIC. Obviously with this I've got a ZIF socket, but pretty much all Commodore 64s will have the VIC-II in a socket, so you shouldn't have to desolder anything. Let's power it on. And you'll probably notice that I am using the RetroTink 5X, and the picture looks pretty damn good. So the issue I was having is more or less fixable, but we'll get back to that. Let's have a look at some of these features. Now I do like to use the Easy Flash 3 cartridge just because it's got a lot of detail in the image and there's a lot of varying colors. So it's a good way to see if everything looks what you would expect, but I guess you've got your own favorite program that you can always run to see what the difference is. So first things first, let's just have a look at the software available for this as of right now. I've got everything loaded on the SC to IEC. All this stuff is available on the Kawari GitHub page. But yeah, it's pretty early days, so things might change. Hopefully there'll be more software available soon enough. Let's just start off looking at the first disk, which has most of our setup programs. So there is a config utility. So on this you can change, obviously, the different model VIC-IIs. I've got mine set to the 6569 R3, which is the later PAL model. It's not the last PAL revision, but there's minimal changes between the R3 and the R5 I think I've got floating around here. But yes, you can change it to the older NTSC model, the older PAL model, the later NTSC, and the later PAL VIC-II. Some of the other options here are related to the full-size version, but at the moment there's only one config utility for all models. Well, models that are currently available. So we've got options for raster lines. This does not relate to the VIC-II Mini. That's only for the full-size version. Same with RGB stuff, DVI, RGB, VSync, H-Sync polarity. They're all full-size Kawari related stuff. The S-Luma burst, if you've seen especially a lot of repair videos, you'll notice that there is a white horizontal line down the left side of the screen, which normally is cut off by the older TV's overscan, and you can turn that line on or off. It's a white line on the edge of the screen. Who really cares, I guess. External switch. This is just giving you an indication of if you've got the external jumper switch installed, and that pretty much sits at J1 here. You can install a switch on there, and that way you can have a hardware switch to switch between either NTSC or PAL on boot up. But obviously you can also switch it changing the chip model here in software. Then you'll just have to save and reboot. Close. So at the moment there's no switch connected, so it's going to say off. If I did have a switch and it was switched to on, then it would say on. And locked function, you can pretty much lock the functions so that something doesn't accidentally try and program the Kawari's flash memory. Say if you've got a misbehaving program that tries to write some funny data to a random address of the VIC-II. Normally an original VIC-II will just ignore that or crash or whatever, but it could be possible for something to write something odd to the Kawari's memory, in which case, you know, weird things might result. So that's pretty much it for the config utility. Honestly, I think I'd rather see two separate config utilities, one for the full-size version, which includes all the full-size options, and then just a stripped-down one for the mini version, so you're not getting confused as to why certain options in there or what they do and why they don't change when you change them. So we'll come back to how the NTSC and PAL switch works, both in software and hardware, but let's just keep looking through the disks first. Next thing is QS. This just gives you a list of the available VIC models that it can emulate. And all you need to do is press the numbered choice if you want to change model. So say I wanted to change to the NTSC VIC. We just hit 1, it says done, and on the next reboot, everything looks very NTSC-like, but yeah, not great at the moment because I haven't adjusted any of the settings for the NTSC ones, only for the PAL model. While we're here, let's just demonstrate how that switch works. Now, this isn't actually my Kawari, so I'm not going to be soldering anything to it. I actually borrowed it, or it was lent to me from local retro nut and good mate Nathan, so I'm not going to make any changes to this board. All I'm going to do is take a little pin header with a jumper on top, stick it in there, and if we power it up with that on, we should get the PAL model. So yeah, that's kind of how the J1 jumper switch works. If it's closed, it'll just boot up into the opposite NTSC or PAL from whatever you've saved it as default. I'm going to switch back to PAL as default because yeah, the NTSC does not look great right now. And I'm just used to PAL. Alright, so next one is the RGB editor. This allows you to edit the color palette for RGB. Again, this isn't related to the mini version, so we'll load it up just so you can see what it looks like. Looks like that. But yeah, as I said, that's not a function of the mini version, only the full-size version. Next is Comp Edit. This is the one that we can change with the mini version. And yes, so you can change the luma intensity, the phase, and also the amplitude of all the default colors that a normal VIC-II would put out. I've already adjusted these from the defaults. We'll come back to why that is once we look at this odd video issue that I found. Next thing on the disk is the EEPROM editor, which I believe is going to be related to both the mini and the full size. But yeah, you don't want to mess around with this. And I think you do actually need to swap some of the jumpers on the actual Kawari in order to change these settings. Again, it's just so something doesn't accidentally try and write to one of these things in memory. So nothing really to look at here, and I wouldn't want to mess with it without knowing what it's going to do. Reg test, I don't actually know what that does. Let's have a look. Right, so reg test is just testing a bunch of things with the Kawari, making sure everything passes. Yeah. Woo! And math test looks like it's doing a similar thing. It's just testing out some math functions of the Kawari. Not that exciting. RGB test, I dare say, is going to be related to the full-size model, so it's probably not going to do much on this one. We get a black screen. So yeah, it would be nice to have these sort of separated for the mini and the full size. Just a separate disc for both, I think, would be a better way to go. I guess I could go through this and delete the things that aren't related to this particular board, but no, maybe a separate disc for each model might be a better option. I don't know. Luma test, this just has, as you can see, a bunch of black and white vertical scrolling lines, and I think this is just to see, looking on an oscilloscope, what kind of voltage levels they're at. We'll come back to oscilloscope things as well later. Finally, there's two 80-column programs. The 80-column Kawari is, I think, a driver for Nova Term, so you can incorporate 80-column mode into some different software. I haven't really played with that. And the 80-column 51200 allows us to switch into 80-column mode with the sys command. Oh, I'm trying to run it. Yeah, running it, you'll try and get a syntax error in one, but if you do a sys 51200, you've got 80-column mode. And pretty sharp 80-column mode. I mean, even with composite, you can sort of just make out all the characters. But yeah, obviously with composite, you're going to get some color fringing and certain colors are going to look illegible. This is kind of helped by the fact that I'm not using an original RF modulator. This is my own design in here. We'll go through that in a later video, but just in case you're wondering, it does pretty much output the exact same voltages that an original RF modulator would supply. So the issue that I originally saw with the 5X and the Kawari is not down to my RF modulator. I did make sure to double check that. It behaved the same way with like a original Commodore 64 RF modulator. So yeah, that is not exactly the issue. So yeah, it doesn't look great on composite, but yeah, composite will always struggle with a color 80-column mode. In fact, what I can do is just disable color. There we go. That's a bit more readable. And yeah, switching back to S-Video, you can pretty much read everything. This is bad sort of contrasting colors, but yeah, it looks way better than composite, obviously. All right, let's have a look at disc 2. Disc 2 is a demo disc, and the demo does not run correctly on the SD-IEC. I think the demo contains some fast loader program type stuff, and yeah, SD-IEC is not good with fast loaders. But this will run correctly on a Pi 1541. You just need to make sure the graph IEC function is turned off. If you want more info on that, yeah, check out the GitHub page. And if you want to actually see the demo in full, check out Randy's last video on the Kawari. I'll link that up there. I think that's what disc 2 and 3 are. And then disc 4 is some other demos. There's the like Amiga bouncing ball and some high resolution images. Again, Randy showed that off in his last video, so maybe check that out if you want to see it in full. I don't even know if these will load. Oh yeah, they will load on the SD-IEC. There we go. In case you're wondering, the file browser that I'm using with the SD-IEC at the moment isn't the standard CBM browser or whatever it's called. It is slightly different and it loads single load programs way faster. Just like that. I have done a video in the past on ways to speed up the loading time on the SD-IEC, so I'll throw a link up there. I'm throwing out a lot of links today. And there we go, that is a demonstration of high res mode. I think that's 4 color 640 by 200 if I remember. Yeah, if you want to see more of what this can do in terms of resolutions and color palettes, check out Randy's last video. He goes through the whole demo and explains what you're actually seeing. I'm not even going to try and do that. All right, so let's just pop this out for a second and take a closer look at the underside. So there isn't a huge amount to see here, but what you'll notice is these two guys here. These are the PAL and NTSC crystal oscillators. So the Kawari doesn't actually use the Commodore oscillator on the board unless you set it to, and that is set by these couple of jumpers over here. So by default, the Kawari will use its onboard oscillator for both the VIC-II and PAL modes, but you can move these little jumpers here to set either one or the other as default. Seeing as this is a PAL machine, I'm going to move the PAL jumper to use the onboard oscillator. It doesn't really matter too much, but you will find some incompatibility with certain things using the Kawari's onboard oscillators. So I'm going to set this to use the C64 crystal for PAL, and obviously NTSC I'll leave it as that because otherwise NTSC won't work at all. So the Kawari is now only using its oscillator for NTSC, and it's using the C64 oscillator for the PAL signal. So everything should still work as usual. I guess the only time it wouldn't work is if, say, you had an issue with the actual Commodore where maybe the crystal oscillator wasn't working. Just remove the 8701, so there's no clock signal making it to the VIC-II socket anymore. And yeah, the machine doesn't boot. But let's say, for instance, you had this set to both the onboard oscillators and something was wrong with the clock on the Commodore 64, you'll still have a working machine. So I guess it's kind of handy for troubleshooting a C64 that's not booting correctly, or I don't know, some other reason. Now, as an example of something that won't work with the onboard oscillators with the Kawari, I've plugged in a Commodore RAM expansion, or REU. Let's have a look and see what that does, but first I need to swap my original power brick because that will not supply enough current to power an REU. So to power it, I'm going to use this thing, which does look like an original brick, but it actually has a Meanwell power supply supplying the 5-volt rail, so this should work out just fine. So on first boot, everything looks normal, but if we actually run the test program for the REU, it should fail. I think this is a 1764. I've got it out of the case because I do plan to populate the extra RAM bank. Let's try this. RAM expander not present. It is present. Let's just pop that back in. Right, so that's kind of interesting. It wasn't even detecting the REU with the 8701 clock generator removed from the board. So I guess you need at least part of a functioning clock signal, even if you're using the onboard Kawari clocks for that to work. Does that make sense? All right, let's run the test program. And immediately you can see that the tests have failed. So that's what it looks like when trying to use the onboard oscillator of the Kawari. And if we swap the jumper to use the onboard C64 oscillator, right, and as you can see, the test fully passed using the onboard Commodore 64 oscillator. So yeah, all good there. There are a few other things that might play up when using the Kawari onboard oscillator. I think there's a list on the GitHub page which may change over time. So looking at some of the other things on the board, we've obviously got an LED power indicator here, but there are a few other jumpers scattered around the place. And I did ask Randy on the Kawari Discord what these were because I couldn't see it. I thought I saw it somewhere on the GitHub page, but then I couldn't find it again, so I just asked. And he got back to me pretty quickly. So J1 we've discussed is the hard switch of the PAL and NTSC modes. J2 can be attached to the reset line in order to reset the Kawari when a reset signal goes to the CPU. It doesn't really seem to be needed for anything, but maybe it'll come in handy one day. JP1 is used to flash the EEPROM on the first configuration, so that again, that probably wouldn't be used by anyone. JP2 is used to boot to the factory image saved on this. So say if you had an issue where you were flashing a new firmware and you had a power outage or something, you can get back to the original version saved on there. Again, it's unlikely to be needed, but it's nice that it's included. And JP3 resets all the configuration options of the Kawari. So shorting that will change the screen border color to white. In fact, we may as well demonstrate that. So let's just short JP3, and you can see the border all changed to a white color. And now if I power off, power back on, we are back in NTSC mode by the looks of it. And then if we run the configuration utility, so it tells us that the EEPROM must be initialized to factory defaults. So let's initialize it back to PAL. And then everything looks pretty horrid with the RetroTink 5X again. So that's kind of all I originally planned to show, but it wasn't until I hooked this up to the 5X that I saw that horrid video quality and wondered what was going on internally. So I broke out the oscilloscope and had a look at some of the signals there. And for the most part, everything looks fine. I actually used the other Commodore 64 that has an original RF modulator in it to check these signals out. And the signals seem to conform. I looked at the composite video signal, and the video signal pretty much matched what I was seeing with a regular VIC-II. Peak to peak was about 1 volt, but there was a bit of an oddity with both the chroma and also where the front and back porch and black levels were. So you can kind of see with the stock VIC-II that the chroma signal has a lot more amplitude than the Kawari. This is a little bit odd, and I can't really explain why it is. It looks to be just something that was set up in the Kawari itself. What I actually did with the chroma issue, I simply took the RetroTink 5X, went into the post-processing and just boosted the color pretty much up to the max. And that kind of sorts out our chroma issue. A lot of the other displays that I tested this with don't seem to be that sensitive to the chroma amplitude, and all of them look pretty much fine. But for whatever reason, the 5X is very picky about this. I guess it's kind of a good thing in a way, because otherwise I wouldn't have noticed this issue, but yeah, it's just kind of annoying at the same time. So that was kind of a workaround to fix the chroma issue. The other thing that I could have done using my RF modulator replacement, and yes, I will do a video on this very soon, is I can actually adjust the chroma and luma amplitudes on this board itself. So there is a spot here for both a trim pot for chroma and a trim pot for luma. I've actually got the ideal sort of resistor values installed, but this board just has the option to install trim pots there instead. All I did here, if I turn the color boost back down, all I did here is put another resistor in parallel to the chroma resistor because I didn't bother installing the trim pots. The resistor values on this board are pretty much from what I found perfect. But yeah, like I said, you can install a trim pot there instead if you want to manually adjust these settings. So yeah, bringing that down results in an image that looks pretty close to the right chroma level from what I can see. So for whatever reason, the Kawari is putting out a chroma level a lot lower than a standard VIC-II. I did have a close look at this board, and I can see that the chroma signal goes through what looks like a little resistor ladder here. Those resistors I think are 0201 size, so definitely not something I'd try and change by hand soldering. And again, this isn't my board, so I'm not going to make any changes to it anyway. So on my RF board, I can lower the value of that chroma output resistor, and that boosts the actual amplitude of the chroma output signal. So that way I can set the RetroTink 5X back to 0 on the color boost and still have the colors look mostly right, but it still doesn't deal with this little white blooming issue. So the other thing I mentioned was the front and back porch and black level settings. On the scope, I could see that there was only about 200 millivolts between the black level and the sync tip that difference should be about 300 millivolts. And conversely, the difference between the peak white and pure black level was about 800 millivolts, whereas it should be set at about 700 millivolts. So although the overall voltage is 1 volt peak to peak, something weird is going on with the black level setting. Thankfully, that is adjustable using the Kawari utilities. So if we take a look at the composite settings editor, we can actually adjust the luma level of the actual black color on the Commodore 64, and we can also adjust the black level. This is more like adjusting the front and back porch level. But what I actually found was bringing the black level up to 19 and also bringing the black color level up to 19 corrected this issue. So now we have 700 millivolts peak to peak between pure black and full white, and 300 millivolts between black and the sync tip. Why this was set up differently on the Kawari in the first place, again, I don't know. This is for PAL. For NTSC, setting the black level to 19 and then setting the luma level of the black color up to about 1C or 1D is probably correct. Black on NTSC is actually a little bit above the black level, or the front and back porch level. I think it's about 50 millivolts. But to be honest, for NTSC, I just set the black color at the same as the black level. I don't think it's going to cause many major issues, and especially if you're using this on like a 16:9 display, the black horizontal borders might look a little bit darker than the actual black image from the Commodore 64 if you've got the luma level of the black color set a little bit higher than the actual black level. So yeah, it's to be within NTSC spec, 1C or 1D is probably about right, but to be honest, I just set it at 19 for both PAL and NTSC. Changing these black levels has an effect on all the other colors, so if we have a look, as I change the black level, you'll notice that everything pretty much gets a little bit darker. So I did actually have to go through and using a screenshot from an original VIC-II and sort of overlaying it on the computer, I can actually see what the most accurate setting for all these is. So let me just change all these just quickly. All right, and with all those settings like this, it looks very close to what an original VIC-II 6569 R3 looks like. This is both on the RetroTink with either the color boosted, or in my case, I've adjusted this through my RF modulator. But yeah, either boosted on the RetroTink, or if you can adjust it in hardware, feel free to give that a try. This looks right with the RetroTink 5X and pretty much looks accurate with every other display. So changing all this stuff doesn't break compatibility, I guess you'd call it, with other displays. Everything looks a lot more accurate, in my opinion anyway. Now obviously this is for the 6569 R3. I haven't tried to do the same adjustments with one of the NTSC versions, nor have I tried it with the older PAL R1 revision. So yeah, this is what it now looks like with my settings. So we do now have those little dots in those white areas visible again. So I think this looks pretty accurate. As a comparison, I've got the R3 VIC installed with my color adjustment removed, and that's what we get. The R3 does have some interference. If you look down at the bottom area in the blue border and also the sort of lighter gray areas in the selection boxes, you can see a bit of noise there, which the Kawari definitely doesn't have. Two of the reasons the output is pretty crappy from a Commodore 64 is the VIC-II itself and the RF modulator. Both of these have an effect on the sharpness and also noise in the video output on a Commodore 64. So replacing both of these results in a very clean video output. As a comparison, this is what an original VIC with an original RF modulator looks like with the RetroTink 5X. So doesn't look great, looks a little bit washed out. Those white areas are missing all the little pixels in between, and there is a little bit more noise to the image versus my RF replacement. And yeah, it's same deal with the Kawari. So the color's a little bit muted maybe, and the details in those white areas are pretty much all missing. But overall, the image is a little bit cleaner than with the original VIC-II. So Kawari plus original RF modulator will produce a better result, and Kawari with a replacement RF modulator, like the one that I will eventually show on the channel, probably produces the most clean result you can get from analog luma chroma video. If you want to be really clean, obviously get the full-size Kawari when it's available. I think you can already pre-order it. Yeah, that way you can have, you know, digital video out directly from the Kawari, and that bypasses any analog interference. The only tricky part with that is running the HDMI out of the actual case. I guess you could remove the RF modulator if you're only running digital video and just run it out through there. But like I said, it is DVI, it's not actual HDMI, so there's no audio included in that. Right, future me here, and after chatting with Randy, we pretty much got to the bottom of this color issue. The Kawari does put out a bit of a low chroma signal, but it's not helped by the fact that there's a bug in the current version of the RetroTink 5X firmware. Version 2.77 ignores the color burst signal. It pretty much uses it to determine if there's a color burst there or not. But on every other display that I tested this with, changing the color burst in the settings actually has an effect on the overall color saturation. So at the moment, I've gone back to version 2.76 on the RetroTink 5X, and as you can see, changing the color burst does indeed have an effect. On version 2.77, changing that color burst value does absolutely nothing at all. And I did also test out the upcoming 2.98 firmware version for the 5X, and that also has the same bug, so it pretty much ignores the color burst amplitude. So in the end, if you've got a RetroTink 5X that you want to use this with, I'd recommend using version 2.76. Otherwise, if you've got a replacement RF modulator that you can adjust the chroma amplitude with, you can also do it that way and then use the current 5X version. But I think there's probably a few people that are going to have a 5X and a Kawari at the same time, so it's probably not a huge deal. Like I said, this does work correctly on the other displays that I tested. It was only once I got to the using it with the 5X with that version 2.77 that I had a strange issue. So yeah, thanks to Randy for suggesting trying a different firmware version. Believe it or not, it just worked. I have reported this bug in the RetroTink Discord server, so if you find the same issue, have a look there, see if there's any updates. But for now, back on with the show. So that concludes my look at the VIC-II Kawari Mini. Would I recommend it? Yes, especially if you've got a Commodore 64 with a dead VIC-II, because why not just replace it with something better that's going to live almost indefinitely, at least a lot longer than an original VIC-II would. And from looking at the prices on eBay, the NTSC VIC-II seem to have shot up in price. They're close to around $100 from what I can see in Australia. Obviously, I'm only seeing the listings that'll post internationally, so maybe they're a little bit cheaper in the US itself. For the PAL VIC-IIs, I see them go around $40 or $50 Australian. So yeah, not as big of a jump as the NTSC versions, but considering that the Kawari is 100 and something, low hundreds for the mini version, yeah, I'd just get a Kawari, to be honest. Will I be picking one up myself? I think so. For the full-size HDMI version, I don't know. I might get one. I do a lot more stuff with analog video. I don't really do a huge amount of stuff with digital video signals, and when I do, I use the 5X most of the time, so I don't know. But yeah, I am definitely impressed with the features from the Mini, so I would recommend it. Even if you just want to easily swap between PAL and NTSC, this thing makes it so simple. Hopefully there'll be some more software that can take advantage of this thing. I imagine, you know, as it gets out there more and more, hopefully we'll get some more development in terms of software. Yeah, even just from a hardware perspective, I am pretty impressed. So I think I will pick one up. So thank you all for watching. A huge thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon. If you want to do the same, links to that are down below. A huge thanks to Nathan as well for letting me borrow the Kawari Mini. I hope you don't expect to get it back. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to relax with some games before I have to give this thing back in some pretty clean analog video goodness. So as always, thanks for watching the Retro channel. Be sure to like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.